In 2008, a cotton swab was pressed against the inside of Muammar Gaddafi's cheek. The sample was collected without much ceremony. The results, when they came back, were not released publicly for years. When they finally were, several historians in North Africa stopped mid-sentence. Not because the results proved something extraordinary, because they proved something that had been systematically buried for 4 decades, and Gaddafi himself may never have understood what he was holding. This is a story about blood, about what a genome can expose when the man it belongs to has spent 30 years erasing exactly that history from public record. The DNA results that surfaced from that 2008 collection pointed to a haplogroup designation that geneticists call EM81. That label sounds clinical. What it means is not. EM81 is the single most common paternal genetic marker among the Amazigh people, the indigenous population of North Africa, the people the ancient Greeks called Berbers, the people Gaddafi spent the better part of his rule marginalizing, suppressing, and in some cases imprisoning for speaking their own language in public. Let that sit for a moment. The man who banned the Amazigh language from Libyan schools, who refused to acknowledge the Amazigh as a distinct ethnic group, who referred to any assertion of Berber identity as a colonial invention designed to divide the Arab world. That man carried in his own cells one of the most distinctively Amazigh genetic signatures in the entire Mediterranean basin. The headline version of this story writes itself, and it has been written badly, repeatedly, with more interest in the irony than in what the irony actually means. So before going any further, the claim needs to be examined properly. Because the truth here is more complicated than the headline and also more damning. The biggest claim circulating about Gaddafi's DNA is this: that genetic testing proved he was Amazigh, not Arab, and that this exposes his entire political project as a fraud built on a lie about his own origins. That version is satisfying. It is also imprecise in ways that matter. Genetic haplogroups do not map cleanly onto ethnic identities. EM81 is prevalent among Amazigh populations. Studies have found it in roughly 60 to 80% of Amazigh males tested across Morocco, Algeria, and Libya. But it also appears, at lower frequencies, in other North African and sub-Saharan populations. A haplogroup is a lineage, not a census category. It tells you where a paternal line has been traveling across thousands of years. It does not tell you who someone is, who they believe themselves to be, or what language their grandmother spoke. Gaddafi was born in 1942 near Sirte, in a region of Libya where Arab tribes and Amazigh communities had lived alongside and intermingled with each other for centuries. His family was part of the Qadhadfa tribe. The Qadhadfa are classified as an Arab tribe in Libyan social organization, but classification and genetics are not the same system, and they have never been. This is where the gamma sequence becomes necessary, because once you pull the sensationalized claim apart, what remains is actually stranger and more significant than the original version. The question is not whether Gaddafi was secretly Amazigh in some identity sense that he was hiding. The question is what it means that a haplogroup this prevalent in Amazigh populations shows up in a man whose political career was built on the argument that Amazigh identity did not meaningfully exist. Geneticist Pierre Zalloua, who has spent over 2 decades mapping ancient and modern population genetics across the Levant and North Africa, has noted that EM81 traces back to populations that inhabited the Maghreb long before the Arab migrations of the 7th and 8th centuries, long before Islam reached the coast, long before the concept of an Arab world existed in any political sense. The lineage is old. It predates almost every political category that has been used to divide North Africa in the modern era. What the DNA reveals is not that Gaddafi was lying about his ethnicity in any simple biographical sense. What it reveals is that the genetic history of North Africa does not respect the political boundaries he spent 40 years trying to enforce on it. That is a different, harder finding. To understand why North African historians went quiet when these results circulated, you have to understand what Gaddafi actually did to Amazigh communities during his rule. In 1969, when he took power in a coup, Libya's Amazigh population had maintained a fragile but functioning cultural presence. Tamazight, the Amazigh language, a language with written forms predating Arabic in North Africa by centuries, was spoken in homes, in markets, in communities across the Jebel Nafusa mountain region and the western coastal towns. It was not a relic. It was alive. By the mid-1970s, Gaddafi's government had moved to extinguish it systematically. Tamazight was removed from schools. Amazigh names, personal names, place names, were replaced with Arabic equivalents or simply prohibited. Cultural organizations that maintained Amazigh heritage were shuttered. The 1973 Cultural Revolution, as his government called it, explicitly targeted what it labeled tribal and separatist identities. The Amazigh were not mentioned by name. They did not need to be. Everyone understood the target. Individuals who publicly identified as Amazigh faced harassment, job loss, and in documented cases, detention. This was not informal social pressure. It was policy. I've spent time reading testimonies collected by Amazigh diaspora organizations in the years after 2011, accounts from people who grew up in the Jebel Nafusa during the Gaddafi era. What strikes you is not the anger, though the anger is there. It's the specific detail of what was lost. One woman describes her father burying a handwritten Tamazight dictionary inside a tin container in the garden. Not a dramatic act of resistance, a precaution. The same kind of precaution you make when you are not sure whether the thing you love will be allowed to exist next year. Here is where the DNA evidence stops being a piece of political irony and starts being something more structurally significant. The EM81 haplogroup found in Gaddafi's paternal line is not unusual in Libyan Arab tribes. This is the finding that most reporting on this story quietly skips over because it complicates the narrative. Studies conducted across Libya, Algeria, and Tunisia, including work by population geneticist Nourdin Harich, who has specialized in Maghrebi genetic diversity, have found EM81 frequencies ranging from 40 to 75% in populations that identify as Arab, not Amazigh. The genetic boundary that Gaddafi's political project depended on does not exist in the genome. It never did. The Arab migrations that transformed North Africa's linguistic and religious landscape in the medieval period did not erase the genetic population that was already there. They layered on top of it, mixed into it. The people who came to call themselves Arab in Libya were, in very large part, the biological descendants of the people who had been there for thousands of years before. Gaddafi's DNA did not expose him as an imposter. His DNA exposed the premise. The premise that Arab and Amazigh are biologically distinct categories, different peoples with different origins who must be ranked and separated, that premise has no genetic foundation. It is a political construction. And Gaddafi's own genome, whatever he understood or did not understand about it, is one data point in a much larger body of evidence making that case. The 2011 uprising changed the landscape abruptly. When Gaddafi's government fell, the Amazigh of the Jebel Nafusa were among the first to take up arms against it. Towns that had spent 40 years suppressing their own language raised Amazigh flags publicly within weeks of the regime's collapse. Tamazight was added to Libya's interim constitutional declaration as a protected language, a sentence that would have been illegal to say aloud under the previous government. Within 2 years, Amazigh language radio stations were operating. Schools were attempting to reintroduce Tamazight instruction, though without trained teachers, standardized curricula, or government support, the effort was difficult. The genetic evidence, as it circulated more widely after 2011, was received differently by different groups. Some Amazigh activists used it pointedly. Here is proof that the man who erased us carried our lineage. Some scholars cautioned against overreading a single haplogroup result. Both responses were reasonable. What cannot be argued is the demographic reality the genetics reflects. North Africa's population has always been, at the genomic level, more continuous than its political history suggests. The Great Divide Gaddafi's ideology depended on, between Arab settlers and indigenous Amazigh, between legitimate nationals and tribal holdovers, was never written in biology. It was written in law, in school curricula. In the decision of one man with state power to determine which people's existence would be officially acknowledged, there is still a question the DNA evidence cannot answer, and it is the more interesting one. Did Gaddafi know? The 2008 sample was collected as part of a program studying political leaders, not commissioned by his government, and the results were not publicized during his lifetime in any form he would have encountered officially. There is no record of his reaction because there may have been no opportunity for a reaction. But the question of knowing is almost beside the point. The suppression of Amazigh identity in Libya was not a personal decision rooted in personal genetics. It was an ideological project. People enact ideologies that contradict their own biology, their own family histories, their own inheritance constantly, across every century, every civilization, every political system on record. The genome does not determine the politics. It just records what was there before the politics arrived. What the DNA result does, when placed next to the specific history of what was done to Amazigh communities under Gaddafi's rule, is make the abstraction concrete. This is not a story about populations or percentages or haplogroup frequencies. It is a story about a handwritten dictionary buried in a garden, about a language removed from schools by government order, about communities that were told for 40 years that the history they carried was not real. The genome says otherwise. It has been saying otherwise for thousands of years. It just needed someone to read it. What does it mean when the biological record and the political record contradict each other so completely? Not just in Libya, not just in North Africa. In almost every place where ethnic nationalism has used the language of blood and origin to exclude a group, the genetic evidence has eventually pointed in the same direction. The boundaries are invented. The populations have always been mixed. The purity being defended never existed. Gaddafi's DNA results are one data point, but they sit inside a pattern that has appeared from the Balkans to South Asia to the Americas. Wherever someone decided that the people already living somewhere did not count as the real people, the genetic record quietly accumulates evidence to the contrary. That pattern does not resolve itself. It just becomes harder to ignore. The woman whose father buried a Tamazight dictionary in the garden grew up to teach the language to her own children. She does this in a country that is still sorting out, 12 years after Gaddafi's death, what official recognition of Amazigh identity actually means in practice. The Constitution has not been finalized. The schools are inconsistent. The radio stations continue. The genome does not tell you how that story ends. It only tells you how long the people in it have been there.